Elias lived his life through a windshield. The night was his sanctuary, a vast, ink-black canvas where the constant roar of his truck's engine drowned out the persistent whispers of a shattered past he could never quite outrun. For years, he had preferred the long-haul routes that stretched across the skeletal remains of lonely rural highways, places where the silence was heavy and the human connection was kept to a minimal flicker. The grief he carried was a silent passenger, a cold, immutable weight in his chest that had settled there after his father's mysterious disappearance decades ago. He didn't seek closure anymore. He simply sought the void. On this particular night, the coastal highway was swallowed by a thick, oppressive fog that seemed to bleed out of the asphalt itself like a ghostly tide. The rhythmic, mechanical sweep of the windshield wipers provided a hypnotic metronome to his isolation, clearing away the relentless rain only for a fleeting second before the world turned gray and blurred again. The yellow glow of a flickering streetlight signaled the approach of an abandoned gas station, its rusted pumps standing like iron tombstones in the deluge. As Elias slowed his rig to navigate a sharp bend, his headlights cut through the translucent mist, illuminating a figure standing perfectly still by the roadside. It was a young woman. She wore a pale blue dress that looked strangely out of place against the jagged industrial backdrop of the highway. Despite the torrential downpour, she didn't crouch or shiver. She simply stood there, watching the road with a terrifyingly calm expression. Against every survival instinct that told him to keep driving into the dark, Elias felt a strange, magnetic pull. He hissed air from the brakes and pulled the massive vehicle to a shuddering halt. When the door creaked open, the scent of damp earth and sharp ozone flooded the heated cab. "Do you need help?" Elias asked, his voice gravelly from hours of total silence. The woman looked up, her eyes reflecting the dim cabin light with an intensity that made his skin prickle with a sudden chill. She climbed into the passenger seat without a single word, her movements fluid and silent as a shadow. "The Weeping Bridge," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I need to get to the bridge. Someone is waiting for me there." Elias nodded slowly, shifting into gear. He introduced himself, but she only offered a single name: Sarah. As they pulled back onto the dark ribbon of road, a chilling realization began to settle in the pit of his gut. The rain was slamming against the roof of the truck with enough force to dent metal, yet Sarah's dress was perfectly dry. Not a single drop of water clung to her hair, and no damp footprints marked the floor mat. She looked as though she had been plucked from a sunlit meadow rather than a storm-lashed highway. In her hands, she clutched an antique silver locket, rubbing the polished metal with a thumb in a repetitive, nervous motion. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was heavy with the unspoken weight of things lost to time. Sarah began to speak, her voice sounding like a distant echo in a hollow hallway. They talked of loss, not as a tragedy, but as a physical burden, a stone carried in the pocket until the fabric eventually tore. She spoke in riddles about the necessity of crossing over and the exhaustion of ending a cycle that had been spinning for far too long. Elias found himself opening up, mentioning the hollow space his father had left behind, a wound that remained unhealed despite the passage of 20 years. Sarah listened with an ancient sort of empathy, her gaze fixed on the darkness ahead. "Memories are just anchors," she said softly. "Sometimes we have to cut the rope to keep from drowning." The atmosphere inside the cab grew colder, the heater struggling against an invisible chill that seemed to radiate from the woman beside him. The fog outside grew so dense, it felt like driving through thick milk. Before we continue this journey into the dark, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from, as the mysteries of the road often span across the entire world. Elias gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. He could see the jagged silhouette of the bridge beginning to emerge from the mist, a skeletal structure of iron and stone that spanned a black, rushing gorge. The Weeping Bridge lived up to its name, the wind howling through its girders like a choir of the damned. "We're almost there, Sarah," Elias said, glancing toward the passenger side to reassure her. The words died in his throat. The seat was empty. The depression in the cushion where she had been sitting was smoothing out as if no one had ever been there. Elias felt a surge of pure, cold adrenaline. He looked at the floor, the dashboard, the back of the sleeper cab. Nothing. He reached over and tugged on the passenger door handle. It was still locked from the inside, the deadbolt firmly engaged just as he had set it when they started. The antique silver locket was gone, the woman was gone, and the only sound remaining was the rhythmic, mocking thump of the windshield wipers against the glass. The bridge loomed ahead, a gateway into a past he was no longer sure he understood. Elias slammed his foot onto the brake, the heavy truck groaning as massive tires shrieked against the wet pavement. The sudden stop jerked him forward, but his eyes never left the empty passenger seat. He scrambled out, boots splashing into icy puddles. "Sarah!" he shouted, his voice cracking against the howling wind. He circled the rig, his flashlight beam cutting desperate arcs through the fog. There was no one. The bridge stretched into the gloom, a desolate span above a churning river that roared like a beast below. He checked the sleeper cab, tossing aside blankets, but the small space held only the scent of old coffee and his own mounting terror. The door had been locked. The window was up. It was impossible. He stood in the center of the road, the rain soaking through his jacket, feeling the crushing weight of the inexplicable. Sleep was a phantom that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that pale blue dress and the calm expression in Sarah's eyes. Driven by a restless obsession, he found himself at the town archives the next morning. The air smelled of dust and decaying paper. He spent hours scrolling through ancient microfilm, his fingers trembling as he searched for any mention of the bridge. Then he found it. A headline from 20 years ago stared back. Wedding night tragedy at the Weeping Bridge. The grainy photograph showed a woman with the same ethereal beauty, wearing a dress described as pale blue. She had vanished on her way to her reception, leaving behind only a trail of questions and a grieving groom. But it wasn't just Sarah's face that froze the blood in Elias's veins. As he read further, his heart hammered against his ribs. The article mentioned a motorist who had stopped to help a stalled vehicle on the bridge that night, a man who had also disappeared into the mist and was presumed drowned in the treacherous currents. The name was unmistakable. It was his father. The bridge wasn't just a landmark. It was the site of the original sin of his life, the place where his world had fractured 20 years ago. The haunting wound he thought he had buried under thousands of miles of highway was suddenly torn wide open, raw and agonizing. Stunned, Elias walked back to his truck, the sunlight feeling too bright, too artificial. He climbed into the cab, his movements mechanical. As he reached down to adjust the floor mat, his fingers brushed against something cold and hard. He pulled it out, his breath hitching. It was the stark silver locket Sarah had been holding. It felt heavy, vibrating with a faint, rhythmic pulse. With shaking hands, he pried the latch open. Inside, behind a cracked pane of glass, was a weathered portrait of a man in a trucker's uniform, smiling with a youthful vibrance Elias barely remembered. It was his father. The air in the cab turned sharp and metallic, the pungent scent of ozone filling his lungs as if invisible lightning had just struck. He reached for the radio to drown out the silence, but the speakers didn't emit music. Instead, a low, melodic sobbing filled the small space. The unmistakable sound of a woman weeping, layered over the static like a funeral dirge. The hair on his arms stood up. He felt watched, judged by the very air around him. The metallic tang in his mouth grew stronger, a physical manifestation of the force pressing against the glass. Suddenly his cell phone vibrated on the dashboard. The screen showed an unknown number, a string of zeros. He answered with a trembling hand, saying nothing. At first there was only the deafening roar of rushing water, a sound so loud it felt as if the river was pouring into his ears. Then, through the torrent, a haunting whisper drifted through the line, cold and clear. "Come back to the bridge, Elias," Sarah's voice said. "Come back to find what was lost." Elias steered the massive truck through the darkness, the engine's low rumble sounding like a heartbeat against the silence of the night. It was exactly midnight when the iron skeleton of the Weeping Bridge appeared through the gloom, just as it had 20 years prior. The silver locket sat on the passenger seat. He pulled the rig to a halt in the same spot where the tires had shrieked yesterday. The engine clicked as it cooled, and the only sound was the wind whipping through the girders. The fog began to thicken around the truck. Elias stepped out into the mist, the silver locket clutched tight in his palm. The air grew impossibly cold, and the sound of the rushing water beneath him transformed into a rhythmic, pulsing roar. Suddenly, the darkness flickered. Light began to bleed through the fog, not the harsh glare of his headlights, but a soft, golden radiance that smelled of rain. He saw it then, a scene from 2 decades past playing out before him. A car was stalled near the edge of the bridge, its hazards blinking weakly. A young woman in a pale blue dress stood by the railing, her face a mask of terror. Then his father's truck pulled up. Elias watched, his breath hitching as the man he had resented for 20 years stepped out. He didn't see a man who had abandoned his family. He saw a man who didn't hesitate. His father ran toward Sarah. She had slipped, her wedding dress catching on metal as she tumbled toward the abyss. His father had lunged, catching her wrist, his boots sliding on the pavement. Elias moved toward the vision, reaching out a hand that passed through the spectral light like smoke. He saw the strain in his father's shoulders, the sheer desperation to save a stranger. But the bridge was treacherous. The railing groaned and gave way. In that final, terrifying second, his father hadn't let go. They fell together, a tragic silhouette against the black water. The vision began to dissolve, the golden light fading back into the gray fog. Sarah appeared then, standing just a few feet away. Her eyes were no longer hollow with grief, but bright with a silent, eternal gratitude. "He didn't leave you," she whispered, her voice vibrating through the marrow of his bones. "He stayed to keep me from falling alone." Elias felt the bitterness that had hardened in his chest for years begin to crack. The anger he had harbored against the man who never came home shattered. He realized that his father had died a hero, an act of selfless courage. The locket in his hand felt warm now. He stepped forward and held it out. "He loved you, Sarah, and he loved us." Sarah smiled, a gentle expression that seemed to illuminate the bridge. As her translucent hand touched the silver locket, the metal shimmered and dissolved into the mist. The weight that had sat on Elias's chest finally lifted. He stood and watched as 2 figures began to walk away into the fog, hand in hand. One was a woman in blue, the other a man with the broad shoulders of a trucker who had finally finished his long haul. They faded into the white expanse until only the wind remained. The silence that followed was the quiet peace of a closed chapter. Elias climbed back into his truck, watching the first hints of dawn bleed into the horizon. The fog began to retreat, slinking toward the river. He started the engine, and the roar felt like a song of renewal. He shifted into gear and drove across the bridge, leaving the ghosts behind. The sun rose over the coast, painting the sky in gold. For the first time, Elias didn't hide in the night. As he checked his rearview mirror, he saw a single, pristine white flower on the passenger seat. Elias smiled, wiped a tear from his cheek, and drove toward his life.